Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy. I'm delighted to welcome you for tonight's lecture, Art in a State of Siege, Berlin, Kurinskij, Nuremberg, 1942 to 1947, which will be delivered by Joseph Leo Koerner, who is this semester's Marina Kellen French Distinguished Visitor. Joseph's lecture will draw on his great new book, Art in a State of Siege. There are going to be copies out there for you to buy, in this book, he writes of extraordinary works by an unusual group, Hieronymus Bosch, Max Beckmann, and William Kentridge, but also of the responses that their work elicited in moments of exceptional, even existential stress. So I know this is a great book because I've read part of it. I haven't read it all, and that part was great. But also, it has a blurb, a glowing one on the back from American Academy Fellow Daniel Yuta, who's, stand up, Daniel, wherever you might be. Yeah, there he is. It's right here. He did put it on the bottom, but anyway, he says, Joseph Koerner reads art history as an ever-changing and unresolved conundrum of power and powerlessness, and he calls it a brilliantly enlightening book on the perils and promises of art. So ordinarily, I would never read a blurb, but since Daniel, who is a fellow here, delivered that blurb, I thought it was appropriate. We are thrilled to have Joseph here and his family, who are visiting with us this week. He is one of the giants in art history today, and although he is best known as a scholar of the Northern Renaissance, he ranges widely through different periods and throughout his career. And in my experience, he has something very interesting to say about whoever the artist is and whatever the period. And we're especially proud to have him as well as a trustee of our institution, where his contributions have also been tremendous in a number of different areas. And as I mentioned, he is the Marina Kellen French Distinguished Visitor this semester. So let me just say a few words about that. The visitorship is named for Marina Kellen French, a fellow member of the Academy's board, as well as the granddaughter of Hans Arnold, in whose home we are sitting. And she is, I guess, the third generation of Kellen Arnold in the United States. And her generous support, the family's generous support, including hers, has made the American Academy and its programming possible, full stop. The Marina Kellen French Distinguished Visitorship was established in 2012 with the support of the Marina Kellen French Foundation and the Anna Maria and Stephen Kellen Foundation. That is the foundation of Marina's parents, who courted in this very house and who embraced the idea of creating the American Academy when it was brought to them by Richard Holbrooke and Henry Kissinger in the early 1990s. And as an example of Marina Kellen French's lifelong commitment to supporting the arts in New York, Paris, and Berlin, among other places, this distinguished visitorship aims to deepen the transatlantic exchange of ideas and insights on the arts and cultural administration. And I know we have a whole array of artists, art critics, art administrators, museum directors here tonight, so things could hardly be better. And among those who have been to the Academy as Marina Kellen French distinguished visitors are the architects David Chipperfield and Peter Marino, Metropolitan Museum and National Gallery leaders Daniel Weiss and Earl Powell, and artists Olafur Eliasson, Ai Weiwei, and Edmund Duval. So now Joseph Koerner joins that distinguished list. Joseph, of course, as I mentioned, is an Academy trustee, but he has done other great things as well. And he has been a fabulous talent scout as well as a great source of counsel. He is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of the History of Art and has many, really an incredible list of accomplishments. Art and architecture, right? Not just art. I apologize. He is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of the History of Art and Architecture. When you cut and paste, it doesn't always tell you put it in the wrong place. And when he resumes teaching after his sabbatical in Vienna, he will also resume being chair of that department. He is Professor of Germanic Languages and Literature as well, and since 2008, Senior Fellow at the Society of Fellows at Harvard. He is the author of numerous books, including one on the myth of Icarus and Daedalus, self-portraiture in German Renaissance art, another one on the Reformation of the image, as well as studies of Dürer, Bosch, Bruegel, and Paul Klee. One of the fascinating things about Joseph's career is that his first book, Caspar David Friedrich and the Subject of Landscape, was written before he had even done his doctorate in art history, making all the rest of us feel really bad. Because he had that expertise in Friedrich, we were fortunate that he agreed to be drafted into giving a talk for the Academy at the Metropolitan Museum earlier this year during the recent Friedrich exhibition. So this is my second time introducing you. It's becoming a habit. Joseph is also a renowned filmmaker. He has curated several exhibitions, including a retrospective of the work of his father, the Viennese-born American painter Henry Koerner, which was at the Austrian National Gallery. One of his father's painting is the topic of Joseph's documentary, The Burning Child, which was released in 2019, which intertwines personal history, architectural exploration, a strong focus on Viennese interiors and their cultural significance, as well as the story of his grandparents who were murdered in the Holocaust. So as one might expect, Joseph has awards and honors too numerous to mention. But what impresses me is that he has been asked to deliver virtually every major lecture in his field and some outside, including the Slade Lectures at Cambridge and Oxford, as well as the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery in Washington, the Tenor Lectures back at Cambridge, the Gombrich Lectures at the Warburg Institute, and the Avenatti Lectures in the Humanities at Berkeley. So were it not for the American Academy in Berlin, there might not be any more peaks for Joseph to scale. It is a real pleasure to welcome him to the podium to discuss art in a state of siege.
Thank you, Dan. I don't know who that person was, but thank you. Thank you also to Anna Remek and Jana Oroich for organizing this visit. And thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you. So the book's a triptych. It treats 3 images by 3 different artists over half a millennium. And when I finished the book, I realized my 3 artists, Bosch, Beckmann, and William Kentridge, they're all makers of triptychs. What stands apart about triptychs is the continuity and discontinuity across 3 parts. In this triptych by Bosch, we can identify Eden on the left and hell on the right, but what do they have to do with the crazy picture in the middle? That made me happy, because what do the 3 artists have to do with each other? I don't need to say, because Bosch makes it a problem. Their through lines and breaks also make triptychs activate thought, and the thought my images activate were about siege. When most people think about siege, when they imagine it, they picture an enemy surrounding a city to conquer it. There's been sieges since the dawn of civilization. There's no civilization without cities, no cities without enemies, and until recently, no city without walls. Sieges are the worst thing that can befall a people. Not only are you murderously attacked from outside, trapped inside, people become murderous amongst themselves. Greek literature and the Bible agree on this. The siege and fall of Troy and the siege and fall of Jerusalem are the great collective traumas. Now, my book doesn't speaks about this form of siege, but it's mostly about a different one, namely when a ruler or leader or tyrant treats people inside the city walls as if they're enemies. During such siege states, the rule of law is technically suspended, usually by using a clause or loophole in the law. I took my title from the artist William Kentridge. Kentridge coined the phrase art in a state of siege in 1986, when South Africa's president declared a state of emergency in response to what he deemed was civil war. And this emergency lasted several years until the end of apartheid. And in a juridical sense, Nazi Germany was a 12-year-long state of siege. I study art making during states of siege, but I mainly study, and this is important, what art looks like during states of siege. I study the afterlife of images. Here, Beckmann's self-portrait in tuxedo after it was deaccessioned from the Nationalgalerie after the Nazis declared it to be degenerate and arted. Beckmann is, by the way, Kentridge's avatar of art in a state of siege, which is one of my through lines. Tonight, I'm going to focus on what I regard as the crux of the book. Three German writers trying to make sense of Bosch. I've decided to do this because the dock outside this building plays a little role in my story. So World War II had just ended, and its signs lingered even at Harvard, where I teach. Returning GIs doubled the incoming class, compelling the university to convert gymnasia into dorms. To single its normalcy, Harvard revived the Norton lectures, which had been suspended during the war. These lectures were intended to treat, quote, poetry in the widest sense, what Aristotle called the bringing forth of something new. To resuscitate these lectures, the university invited an unlikely speaker, a German Jewish emigre. Erwin Panofsky was a towering figure in the field of art history. Steeped in classical learning, he pioneered new approaches to meaning in the visual arts. But Panofsky was a difficult writer and not the obvious choice for talks aimed at a general public. He rose to the challenge, using it as his topic early Netherlandish painting. And here's the sort of thing he treated: Jan van Eyck's depiction of a patron in dialogue with the Virgin and Christ. Panofsky tried to explain this amazing poetry, you might say, that has made a painted wooden panel look like a slice of life. Panofsky also puzzled over one effect of this artistry. Miracles could be shown physically to happen, but now they had to look like miracles unfolding on our side of the picture plane, and this caused a problem for symbolism. Symbols now had to be incorporated into the represented world. Christ atoned for the sin of Adam and Eve, so the artist smuggled Adam and Eve into his picture as a crafted element within the room's decor. In his lecture, Panofsky found such hidden symbols, and then he interpreted them. This activity was, by his definition, humanistic. He recovered certain exceptional artifacts and deciphered them as humane communiques, as messages sent by friends to friends. But at the close of his final lecture, he met his nemesis. Already at his death in 1516, just over 500 years ago, Hieronymus Bosch was famously obscure, and the painter's works have baffled viewers ever since. The problems are fundamental. To say no consensus has been reached belies the hatred that fuels the question. For one erudite, this painting celebrates carnal pleasure. For his colleague down the hall, it utterly damns the flesh. One recognizes a false utopia, another alchemical tract, a third, and this is true, a Jewish marriage canopy and Aztec calendar combined. Friendship finds no toehold on this carousel of love. For Panofsky, the dilemma had one cause. Originally, the work had a key, the key's lost, closing the work off from us. Faced with an artifact he couldn't, as it were, befriend, Panofsky closed his lectures with the words, "This too high for my wit, I prefer to omit." In the same year, another German art historian made it public. He had found the key. Wilhelm Frenger began his search in 1942 while the Allies bombed his city to rubble. Now Frenger revealed his discovery. In its triptych form, the work looks like a Christian altarpiece, and scholars wonder how this could be the case given all the nudity. Frenger's solution was simple. It was an altarpiece, just not a Christian one. It was the cult object of a sex-crazed sect that engaged in secret orgies, here a later fantasy. And here how Frenger thought Bosch's painting originally stood, enticing initiates to have group sex, to return by way of wanton copulation to the innocence of Adam and Eve. Frenger published this key in a book titled Das Tausendjährige Reich. His publishers in the American sector balked at the title because, in their words, the Nazi catchphrase could easily lead to errors. Also strange for Germany in 1947, Frenger proposed that the painting's mastermind had been a Jew, a backsliding convert to Christianity. Frenger arrived at his theory in 1944 and shared it with only one man, and this man was Carl Schmitt. And by 1947, he sat in prison in Nuremberg, awaiting possible prosecution for war crimes. He had been Germany's most controversial jurist, the brilliant proponent of the idea that politics aren't what we think they are. They aren't about debates, parties, and voting. Politics rests instead on the absolute distinction between friends and enemies. While politics are ordinarily pursued within a legal order, Schmitt argued that the legal order itself arises in states of exception, Ausnahmezustände, which boil down to life and death struggles with an enemy. In this struggle, there'll be a decider, and whoever decides, he is sovereign. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception, is the famous phrase. In 1933, by arguing the legality of Hitler's seizure of power, Schmitt strove to become the juridical Führer of the Führer. After the war, Schmitt was taken into U.S. custody in Nuremberg. His defense: he didn't make the law, he only interpreted it. Other questions were harder to answer. The first one, heading a questionnaire given to him by his detainees, asked, "Wer bist du?" To which Schmitt gave a torturous answer, penned in prison, titled The Wisdom of the Cell. Feeling himself naked before his captors, for whom he was an absolute enemy, a criminal against humanity, Schmitt returned to the resources of his thought. He translated the question, "Who are you?" into its a priori for him, "Who is my enemy?" To which the authoritarian jurist replied, "Self is the enemy. It seeks a new paradise to and through itself." And it was there and then, that Bosch's triptych rose up as the image of the enemy. Quote, "This is the true yearning of the I-crazy. This the new paradise, the Adamitic pleasure of the Garden of Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, set down on panel in white nakedness." The Bosch that haunts Schmitt is Frenger's fantasy, a crypto-Jewish champion of individuality and carnal bliss. In 1946, Frenger had mailed Schmitt the typescript of Das Tausendjährige Reich, and on the eve of his imprisonment, Schmitt was still sending Frenger corrections. It's likely he brought the typescript with him to jail, but its findings were long known to Schmitt because Frenger had outlined them in 1944 in a letter to Schmitt. Frenger owed a debt to Schmitt. Frenger had enlisted one of the jurist's doctoral students to troll the Dutch archive for Jews in Bosch's milieu. The timing is obscene. The Nazi occupiers were deporting some 10,000 to 100,000 Jews from the Netherlands. Only about 500 escaped extermination. Frenger admitted to Schmitt at the time that the search for Jews was uncomfortable, unbequem, but he assured his fervently anti-Semitic friend that this sleuthing would yield amazing results. Frenger also asked Schmitt to be his eyes when, in 1944, the jurist was able to visit the Prado in Madrid and stare at the quote-unquote concentration point in Bosch, meaning the place where Bosch's pictures look out at you. Schmitt was right about one thing. Bosch was an expert in enmity. Hatred was, so to speak, his professional specialty. At the beginning of a stage in European art when, due to an art market that was expanding, painter shops narrowed their production to pictures of saleable types, portraits, landscapes, still lifes, etc., Bosch made the enemy his trademark topic. The devil's hatred of people, people's hatred of people, the Jews' hatred of Christians, the reciprocal hatred of Christians for Jews, the world-dividing hostility between Islam and Christendom, the hatred directed towards an us by an invisible conspiring them, and the wrath of God that consumes just about everybody, this global system of loathing stands not just portrayed in Bosch's pictures, it's performed in them, as if his brush were an instrument of enmity. Hatred contaminates. The aversion these images depict defiles how they act on us and how we react to them. Uncertain whether the image is for us or against us, we turn against each other. Bosch was buried on August 9th, 1516, and if his masterpiece ever had a key, the artist took it with him into his grave. However, Bosch also built his artwork to act like a time bomb set to detonate in every here and now. Bosch's revelers are still pursuing their pleasures on that grassy plain. Chaotic at the edges, their activities circle around the center, as if all that drives them also binds them by some gravitational force. Time's arrow seems here to bend until, drawn into the circle, even it can't escape. And from the ceaseless present, Bosch directs a host of eyes towards us, focusing the image on us, allowing it to pass into life. This is what happens in Eden. Bosch makes it happen now here in Berlin. It's an event never imagined by a work of art. It's not yet the fall of Adam and Eve, not the marriage of them either, when God joins them hand in hand, and it's not even Adam and Eve meeting when they rush towards each other in mutual attraction. No, this moment is the nanosecond after Eve's creation from Adam's rib, when Adam opens his eyes from sleep and first sets eyes on his beautiful mate. It's a fleeting Augenblick, the Dutch is the same word, just the blink of an eye, yet it couldn't be more momentous. Divine creation now stands complete, according to the painting, and natural procreation can take over. Plants, animals, and humans must seed themselves now according to their kind. Here, history begins. Bosch urges us to think this way, that is, to read the scene as an episode within a history. Using the mobile structure of his triptych, he casts the creation scene on the ensemble's outer shutters as Act 1, implying that the inner ones are acts that follow. And in the right panel of that open state, he displays the story's grim conclusion. The scenes of hell make it hard not to read the triptych as showing left to right a beginning, a middle, and an end. So what did happen? Adam gazes fixedly at Eve, shamelessly, for as the Bible states, before the fall they were both naked and were not ashamed. Unashamed, mesmerized looking is the only human action in Bosch's scene, save perhaps for the blood flushing Adam's cheeks. But what does that do? To glimpse the disaster now occurring, we might follow the vector of Adam's gaze, and ordinarily I don't do this, but I'll do it anyway for speed's sake. The men rotating around the pool of women act out the desire that began with Adam's look. This sightline passes through Eve's downcast eyes to what looks to be Eve again, now grabbed by the waist. The couple in the pod enact another step before the visual vector reaches the counterclockwise circle. The circular dance waylays time's arrow, as I said, and it captures our gaze just as Adam's gaze was trapped by Eve. Bosch highlights Eve's blonde tresses with gold so that the fascination the image portrays gets repeated in the fascination the image causes. And as in the beginning, so in the end, the vector of sight terminates in a vortex. The tree man is Bosch's oblique confessional self-portrait. It looks rearward over its ruined body via the pleasures that ruined him, all the way back to Adam, whose facial features he shares. So the world's catastrophic ending happens in the picture's present tense. Bosch collapses the origin of evil into the now of our experience of his painting. He rolls the Bible back to the fleeting instant before the fall, when the only action was looking. And that is the disastrous action in which we are all presently engaged. We look. The picture puts us at its center, And at first, this order seems to belong to the world that Bosch places on display, but this isn't the case. Fountain, pond, and pool align along the picture's central vertical axis, and the four surrounding formations, despite their capricious shapes, flank perfectly the center. Symmetry receives support from outside from the ensemble's triptych format, yet, on closer inspection, nothing is ordered in this painted world. The tips of those distant towers only look aligned, but they're in fact protean, consisting of asymmetrical pinnacles, foliage, and wild birds in flight. Theirs is an order located in the beholder, a symmetry not in the order of things, but entangled in the tunnel vision of desire that trapped Adam and that traps me here and now in my fleeting Augenblick. And those brilliant colors of the central panel, unlike any other painting in early Netherlandish art, they cause the viewer to behold the world as if through idolatrous eyes. So, Frenger was right in one respect. The triptych does resemble a sacred object. Bosch built it that way. He built it to look like an idol of an unspeakable cult. The false hypothesis of a secret heresy reveals something terrifying. The picture's target was never some foreign or forgotten heretics. Its target has always been us, whoever and whenever we are. Painters of enemies, Bosch shows what it looks like to see through enemy eyes. Carl Schmitt's response was shaped by Frenger, and thanks to Frenger, he took Bosch's revelers to be Adamites, although he grasped them differently, as enemies. To the eyes of the authoritarian jurist, nothing could be more loathsome and dangerous than the idea that in an ideal world, people make love, not war. This, for Schmitt, was liberal democracy. In Schmitt's mind, assimilated Jews were the preachers of this idea, wearing, in his words, masks of demonic enigmaticness, end quote. They promised world peace, tempting Christians to deny inborn corruption and turn away from God. Behind such seductive sermons lay the old enemy, Satan, who whispers in Eden and whispers still, "Don't worry, there are no enemies here." The uncanny feature of Schmitt's prison epiphany is that he, Schmitt, of all people, should have gotten Bosch right. In December 1933, 9 months after Hitler assumed total power in Germany, the novelist Ernst Junger wrote to Schmitt to congratulate him on a new edition of his book, The Concept of the Political. Junger noted that modern thought has forgotten the truth of the enemy. To glimpse that truth, Junger wrote, one needs to look at the art of Hieronymus Bosch and to read Carl Schmitt. In Bosch, enmity stands inscribed in the very order of things. Hatred creates a categorical divide of evil against good, human against animal, us against them, all engaged in a cosmic battle that began and will end with God's struggle against Satan. Quote, and this is Junger speaking, writing, "The strangeness of Bosch's pictures derives from the fact that the friend-enemy distinction has become strange to us," end quote. As a soldier in World War II, Junger had reveled in the experience of total mobilization, and in the 1930s he gave literary form to what he called the gripping spectacle of war in its pure gestalt. In Junger's eyes, Schmitt and Bosch were the two unequaled portraitists of the enemy. Why then did Schmitt fail to see his own image in this painting? Schmitt insisted that the enemy is a concrete adversary intending to negate his opponent's way of life. True, the enemy isn't exactly objective because no third party observing the conflict from outside can properly grasp the enemy. Quote, only the actual participants can correctly know, understand, and decide the concrete situation and settle the extreme case in conflict, end quote. The enemy is self-evident, but only to the combatants. It is a decision made by the sovereign. Haunted by Bosch's painting, though, Schmitt's certitude falters. Pacing his thoughts like the floor of his cell, he asks and re-asks the question, "Who is my enemy?" A line of poetry comes to mind by Theodor Deubler, a poet who may have connected Schmidt to Frenger back in the 30s. Deubler's words allow the crown jurist to return to himself. Der Feind ist unsere eigene Frage als Gestalt. The enemy is our own question as a Gestalt. Our own question. That was exactly the Nuremberg interrogator's query too. Who are you, Carl Schmitt? And that makes the enemy intimate, like a friend or a brother. The other is my brother, writes Schmitt, thinking of Cain and Abel. Bosch drew this intimacy forth. At the far end of his enemy painting, he portrayed the rearward face of self. The enemy is our Gestalt, writes Schmitt, and then he remembers silently the poem's next line, und wird uns, und wir ihn zum selben Ende hetzen. And he will hunt us and hound us, and we him to the selfsame end. In May 1944, Schmitt spent several days in Lisbon in the company of Mircea Eliade. The Romanian philosopher of religion was a staunch supporter of Salazar's authoritarian rule in Portugal. He also had a long conversation with Schmitt about Bosch, and from these, Eliade concluded in his diary, quote, "The air raids helped the Germans to understand Bosch and to rediscover themselves in him," end quote. What Germans discovered was a triple siege by Allied forces, by desperate Nazi leaders, and perhaps by moral compunction. In Nuremberg, Schmitt saw himself in Bosch, but misrecognized the painter as his enemy, as his Jewish liberal interrogators. With Ernst Jünger, the recognition was sharper. Sent to the Caucasus front at the end of 1942, Jünger observed firsthand Goebbels' total war. Jünger arrived at Voroshilovsk in November 21st, 1942. Further to the east, the German armies, anticipating easy victory, had encircled Stalingrad, only to be themselves encircled by Soviet troops. Meanwhile, with winter closing in, the army where Jünger was posted stood mired in mountainous terrain. Prussian military doctrine called their predicament a cauldron, ein Kessel. Rather than engaging the enemy along a hostile front line, as happened in trench warfare in World War I, troops might, using new mobile armed instruments, break through the foes at a pressure point and in a wedge movement, a Schwerpunkt und Keil movement. Those breaking through then would eliminate enemy artillery and supplies, while the infantry would turn sideways towards the enemy's vulnerable flanks, dispersing and trapping them in cauldrons. Hitler intended the invasion of the Soviet Union to be a wedge and cauldron war on a continental scale, with Moscow, the pressure point, taken swiftly by tanks and air power, and other troops fanning out to besiege in cauldrons other Russian cities. This had worked in Poland and France, but against Stalin, the blitzkrieg strategy failed. In the 872-day siege of Leningrad, during which more than 1 million civilians died of starvation, and in the siege of Stalingrad more swiftly, the German besiegers were attacked from the rear and surrounded. Jünger recognized his hopeless situation, quote, "A cauldron like this has to be supplied by air until a land bridge can be established," he writes on day 2 of the trip. The predicament conjures sieges from the past, quote, "The threat resembles that of a besieged city from classical times, when no one could escape mercy. For weeks and months, deaths could be seen approaching from afar. Many scores are settled in this way, for the political structures that the states had assumed have been turned inside out." This inversion, end quote, this inversion sparks a powerful fantasy. Surrounded by their enemies and surrendering to their enemies, Germans who showed no mercy can expect none from surviving Jews. Quote, "The cauldron is the purest expression of our situation," writes Jünger. "This was obvious to me before this war began. It was prefigured as such by the fate of the Jews," end quote. This diagnosis, rehearsed by many Germans after the war, involved a triple siege. German troops besieging Stalingrad were surrounded by Stalin's Red Army, blocked by their own commanders, and trapped by their conscience as having supported Hitler's regime. Quote, when someone is not allowed to go back and cannot go forward, explained a German prisoner to his American interrogator, he gets stuck in the middle. Behind us stood the trees on which we would be hung, and in front of us was the artillery, end quote. The approach of Christmas increases Junger's forebodings, sinking deeper into the cauldron, which in the steep ravine that he was in looks like a kettle. He received from his wife a, quote, holiday cake with hazelnuts from the vicarage garden, end quote. From Schmidt, he receives a letter announcing that nihilism, quote, is the urge to be incinerated in a crematorium, end quote. In this kingdom of pain, Junger writes back to Schmidt as follows: mechanical processes as crystallizations of pure violence, along with pain as their passive correlate, recall powerfully certain paintings by Hieronymus Bosch. Dangling, then, he reports the following: dangling midair in a goods cable lift, high above the ravine, Junger observes swarms of captured war prisoners loading the dead onto barges, while horses tumble into the river and flames from the heavy artillery jet through the air. From a small opening in a ruined bridge abutment, an army officer orders down orders to the cannoneers, his shouts mingling with the strains of Silent Night, which was blasted through the valley by big electric loudspeakers. Quote, too bad, Junger writes, that Bosch couldn't paint what I see, this ice landscape that the Netherlandish artist had seen in his time, though the battle back then was one-sided, war against unbelievers, whereas today the war is between atheists. That takes the crown. And the shouting officer peers out through one of the fissures like how people look out of those hollows in Bosch's paintings. What Junger sees below are German atrocities against so-called partisans. In the Caucasus, these were often just children orphaned by the war. On December 31st, on New Year's Eve, Junger confronts the monstrous atrocities head on. He hears mention of trains carrying Jews into the poison gas tunnels, where before he saw men, quote, as through a telescope pointed at the moon, end quote. Now the victims have become real and concrete, as has the perpetrator, quote, that terrible old saying, this is you. Just this once, Junger could not turn life into art. I saw things that cross into the zoological, end quote. Junger left the Caucasus a week later. By January 1944, he reports, air raid alarms are almost a regular occurrence. I used my time to examine The Last Judgment Altar by Hieronymus Bosch in a book by Baldas. Dr. Goerpel gave me this recent publication as a gift. An art historian, Erhard Goerpel, traveled Europe gathering looted Jewish art for an unrealized Führer Museum in Hitler's hometown of Linz. He gifted to Junger Ludwig von Baldas's 1943 monograph on Hieronymus Bosch. Here, that book in my own copy. These paintings, writes Junger, are picture puzzles of horror that continue to reveal new and frightening details. One can actually discern the shapes of fighter bombers and submarines on these panels, end quote. Bosch's monstrosities do not merely resemble or foreshadow weapons of mass destruction. By a quantum wormhole in time, they already are those weapons. But neither do Bosch's vision stand outside of time. For Junger, quote, how apposite is the image of the naked man. In order to propel weird machines, he runs like a squirrel on a spoke-studded wheel, end quote. Time passes manically on, but the human remains trapped in the permanent emergency of his own volition. By coincidence, Bosch's art first fell into my own hands thanks to Baldas's monograph. The book Junger pored through in 1944. That volume has a special meaning for me because of its provenance. My father had literally pulled it from the rubble of a collapsed apartment building in post-war Berlin. Until recently, gray dust was discernible in its binding. Born Jewish in Vienna, He fled his native city in 1938 after Hitler annexed Austria. He managed to escape to New York, where he worked as a graphic designer, making posters and book jackets. Drafted into the U.S. Army, he served in Washington and in London in the propaganda branch of the Office of Strategic Service, the OSS, predecessor of the CIA. After the Allied victory in Europe, he traveled in the entourage of General Lucius Clay, designing posters and informational brochures for Germans under occupation, while also documenting the devastated country with his pen and with a Leica camera. By August 1945, he had settled in Berlin. Wandering the divided city in a lieutenant colonel's uniform, he filled tissue paper sketchpads with intimate drawings of life among the ruins, and turned these into paintings in his studio in Zehlendorf. Whenever the wind was right, he would sail on the Wannsee on a sailboat he kept on the dock just outside the academy. My father reported that whereas some of his fellow officers had entire contents of abandoned houses packed up and shipped back to the United States, he took the Bosch monograph as his sole souvenir. Returning to America in autumn 1947, my father brought with him a prodigious artistic output and nothing else save some army badges and the Baldas's Hieronymus Bosch book. To that book was attached the tale of its discovery in the rubble. In picturing this event, I was guided by one of the paintings my father made while living in Berlin. It featured a bombed-out apartment building with naked survivors pulling rags from heaps of bricks. I knew that my father based the foreground ruin on his own apartment building in Vienna, which he had documented in 1946 in this slightly blurred snapshot labeled on the back, "My Home." The Ferris wheel in the background was also Viennese, evoking the Prater amusement park, which stood a few blocks away from his home in Vienna. It juxtaposed bare survival to a tendency to forget. For me, this painting depicted my father discovering Bosch's monograph in the rubble, and to my eyes, as a child, the illustrations contained in Baldas's book looked almost eerily like my father's painting. The old black and white illustrations of judgment and hell, they became my mental picture of Germany after the war. I was certain that there existed only one such book in the world and that it had been created for me. With Bosch, there's really no escape. Thanks for your attention. So I'm happy to entertain questions, auch auf Deutsch, wenn Sie möchten. Yes.
Just the microphone. Let me hear what you say.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I was enthralled. That was really it felt momentous and it felt like it was propulsive. It's really narrative. But just visually, optically, it looks like Bosch is far more sophisticated than the Italians that were painting at the time. Can you give us some context about how lifelike and real, naturalistic some of his figures look compared to what was going on in other places that was much more two-dimensional, I want to say, in the 1500s?
Right. So he plays a funny role in the history both of Netherlandish art and of European art, which is that by the time he's painting, Northern European artists were painting much bigger figures, much more three-dimensional. They were already beginning to use perspectival forms of representation. And whether Bosch did so because he came from an artistic backwater or more likely because he specialized in these scenes, mainly Last Judgments and scenes of temptation, he reached back to a slightly earlier way of painting where you didn't have any spatial, you didn't have like a three-dimensionality that's kind of ordered. You have this world in which you have a kind of giant abyss of space and then little figures. And then he was very good at all those little figures, because one of the specialties was to conjure with his brush, almost like drawing the figures that he paints. So the answer is slightly that on the one hand, he rejects the developments of early Netherlandish painting that are going on, and certainly the developments which he could have seen possibly through Italy, but his technique is more like drawing related to manuscript illumination, and also just completely unique to himself. And it's important to remember that Bosch was a huge hit in his time. He was collected by the wealthiest and most powerful people in Northern Europe. So he's not in some cultural backwater. He was collected by Philip Fair, the founder of the Habsburg Empire, Margaret of Austria, all the Spanish and Portuguese living as diplomats and princes in Northern Europe. They were the ones who were collecting Bosch. And he sparked a kind of craze for this kind of, you see the way the hand is painted. It's sort of like brushed on, and that was very unique to him. And then there became a whole set of artists who, in a way, rejected Italian influence and did this kind of thing as a business in Antwerp. And the great successor to Bosch is Bruegel. Bruegel starts as a Bosch imitator, and then he also doesn't do Italian style art. He does this Netherlandish style art, does Netherlandish proverbs, does Netherlandish customs, Netherlandish children's games, all in a style that in the beginning resembles Hieronymus Bosch. So there's something also like kind of local about Bosch's style. That was a little long answer, but sorry. I'm always warned not to give such long answers. Yes.
I first wanted to ask about his audience, but you've in part already answered that question, so I need to vary this.
Uh-huh.
Did the people who collected him at the time get any help in understanding what he was doing?
Yeah, so there's like most art of the period before there was art criticism, we don't have a very good idea of how people understood works in this time. And we can't expect that there will be something, some sort of key. But we do have, I left, of course, this out of the discussion, but in the book I talk about the first time the Bosch's picture enters the paper trail. And it's a year after Bosch's death in 1517. An Italian entourage comes to where the picture hung, which was in a pleasure palace in Brussels. And the writer, who's a diarist, says, there was a picture there that I just looked at. You had to see it to believe it. And then he describes it, but he gives no title and no clue to what it is. He gives titles of other works that are rather arcane. So from this, I, vaguely deduce that the kind of theatrical experience of the Bosch's pictures was, first you had these dark panels, which you knew that it was the world at some moment of creation, and it was all gray. And then all of a sudden, the prince or probably his servant opened it up, and everybody went, and then probably no explanation. Why no explanation? Because the minute you start to explain the picture, even if you try and do it so yourself, you say, see, there's like the character with the mushroom on his head, and you say, where? You actually get lost in the details. So my general view is that it was there to not so much to be understood as to evoke a certain kind of wonder, which probably was maybe policed by the prince, who slyly watched people's reactions, because we know that the person who, which is part of the story that I go into, was himself a very, very violent guy who had exterminated whole villages in northern France. So his patron wasn't a nice character. So the situation probably of watching, looking at the painting would have been one very nervous. You're dressed in formal clothing. He opens it up. And what are you supposed to say? There's lots of, for example, sodomitical motifs. Are you supposed to say, oh, I know what's going on there? So the best you just sort of, plus this patron was also fond of playing cruel jokes on his guests. So I think the whatever we call it was a little bit like a cruel joke. And my suspicion is that it was commissioned by the syphilitic uncle of the ruler, who gave it to his nephew for his wedding. So as a wedding present, saying, this is where you're going. There's nothing you can do, but this is where you're going. There's no escape. Yeah, yeah. Hi, Kate. Hi.
Thank you. Absolutely enthralling, Joseph.
Thank
Thank you. And of course, it has a personal resonance.
Yeah.
So, to what extent did your personal history
Mhm.
lead you on this quest,
Right.
or was it the other way around? Did you discover aspects of your own history whilst doing research?
Yeah, that's it's not only a great question, it's a very hard question, right?
Oh, good.
To answer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that I went into Bosch as a scholarly undertaking. But then things catch up, time changes. I mean, I was saying to some people here that, I started working on Carl Schmitt when no one knew who he was. And by now he's in the New York Times all the time as the basic, the kind of ideological template for a certain kind of politics. So there was a time element to it, but I would say, why would I work on Hieronymus Bosch, and why work on these kinds of things? I think certainly my father's painting, which I grew up with, I lived in, not only lived with the art, but actually was with him when he painted many of his paintings as a kid. And these paintings always had something that was disturbing. So for me, art, when I went into art history early on, could never be a victory parade in which the artist, overcoming all sorts of difficulties, wins. Art was always something that was, I guess, what we would call Vergangenheitsbewältigung. My father wouldn't agree with me on that, but that would have been my impression of some of his work. So I suppose I had a tendency to look for work that had this kind of both an urgency for the present moment and some undercurrent in the past that keeps on repeating, a kind of way in which the past suddenly makes sense in a present. And that's something that his paintings tried to do, because he, after making those paintings where he did them in his studio, as you saw, from then on, he did them all actually from life. But he would find a scene in the world, like in Vienna, we would be walking along and he'd see something strange. He would paint that from life. So he wanted things to be present, but why choose that woman at selling oranges by the side of the road near Gumpelskirchen? Something about the selling of oranges by Gumpelskirchen, the way the woman looked, disturbed him, made him paint. And so I think that's something that my art history kind of was working for, but I certainly began Bosch just teaching him, and how interesting it was to teach. He's one of the most interesting artists to teach, because there are no answers, but everybody somehow feels that there is one, and that they're going to find it out. So that's very good and no matter what you say, even if it's right, no one will believe you. I mean, Gombrich came up with a pretty good solution that no one believes him. So I know no one believes me either.
We have the remarkable coincidence of the Wannsee.
Yeah, he was obsessed with that dock and the little boat, and here we are. Absolutely crazy. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. It seems to me that there is an issue with the notion of the presence of the picture.
Yes.
Because on the one hand, you were exploring what it is that we see when we look at it,
Mm-hmm.
and how the painting, actually the figures in the painting, look back to you
Mm-hmm.
as a viewer.
Yes.
But on the other hand, there is a haunting of the painting that doesn't need the painting, where you are...
Doesn't need the viewer.
Doesn't need the viewer, but
Mhm.
doesn't need the painting. It
Uh-huh.
needs the imagination of the painting.
Yes.
You are posing the painting on the cell in which Carl Schmitt is.
Yes.
Or you are or your father discovered the book, but saw the rubble beforehand.
Yes.
So I wonder what it says about art history,
Mm-hmm.
that on the one hand, you need to describe the painting that you see,
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. On the other hand, it's something like a hauntology,
Yes.
where a painting can get a story
Mm-hmm.
without being present as a material object.
Yes.
So that one can even think of a theory of catastrophe that starts with Carl Schmitt, goes on with Benjamin and others, that is a very Boschian history
Yes.
without the presence of the painting.
Yes, and yet I suppose, I mean, that history is really beautiful. And there are so many things to put in play. For example, there's no question, and I can say this in historically rather than interpretatively, that Bosch thought about the concept of the human imagination and the brain, because the one thing he wrote is about how great artists have ingenium, genius, and they can invent anything they want endlessly. And Dürer says the same thing. So in the Renaissance, people, and somehow Bosch understood the Renaissance humanist idea of the imagination, which is a vessel that the human brain has, according to Aristotle and others, but it was being revived. That's also very unruly. And I think Bosch, in some simple sense, said, oh, the imagination began when Adam opened his eyes, and all of a sudden, fantasy. He probably had the imagination before because he was dreaming, because that's part of the story. So he opens his eyes, and there's a plethora of imagination. But Aristotle and Bosch, and probably, I think, people like Walter Benjamin and Ernst Jünger in some ways also know that there's something about the concrete image that is also plays a role in the imagination, and particularly in the historical imagination, that you need something concrete, something that calls forth the imagination. In Aristotle, you need the bombardment of the vessels of perception by actual things that hit the eye, and then imagination takes place. But with Benjamin, it's this more this idea of that somehow images that didn't mean anything maybe in the past suddenly just come up, and they are both, they come from the past and they're totally present. And it seems that Bosch really was that image for this group of Germans at the time, that suddenly it was both it came from the past, but it was a prophecy of what was happening there. There's never in Schmitt any interest in wondering what Bosch meant back then. It's what it means to him, and whether he's going to get whether he's going to stay in prison or be and be hung or whatever. In Jünger, it's more to do with a kind of existential wondering, where am I going from here? But you do need the image, otherwise you do. I think art gives you something that conjures up the imagination. But back again, and then I'll stop, is that another simple way of saying what the Garden of Delights is at some level. I believe that probably the prince said, I want an allegory of lust, because we know that Bosch painted an allegory of avarice, which is much more straightforward, in which the Garden of Delights or the Garden of Eden is there, and Eve is the bad person. And she is sort of tempting everyone. And then all of a sudden you have this big pile of hay, which is avarice, and they're all marching to hell. It's very simple to say. We all are after goods, vanities. With lust, he says, well, how do I do an allegory of lust? So it's something internal, but it's also external. It's Eve who did it, maybe, but it's the imagination that produced Eve. And then what am I going to put in the center? I'm just going to go wild with everything that an imagination can do when it comes to carnal imagination. And I'm going to be the doer of all this imagination. My brush is going to be the creator of all this of all these images, because they're all in the brain. And I'm going to put it on, but I'm going to tell you, you're all going to hell at the end. So there's a kind of moralizing thing, which I think, again, brings back Schmitt, because Schmitt would have said, oh, that's political romanticism. That is the idea you can play with realities. And Schmitt said, no, you don't play with realities, because you're going to be damned at the end. And Bosch sinks with that, I think, more than just playing. Yes, everything's playful, but the human is damned. There's a wonderful Last Judgment in Vienna by him, in which one of the strange things about it is that there are no saved, that as far as the eye can see, everyone's being damned. But if you get up on a ladder, more or less, and take a magnifying glass, you see two of the last heavenly people going away into a little hole that'll soon close up. So you ask yourself, what are you doing? What am I supposed to do? Am I chopped liver? You can't do anything because you're stuck, but you're at least having fun. with the image. And so Bosch wants you to also know that there's something fun about the image, something funny about the image, and something quite disastrous in the moment when you're looking at it.
Professor Koerner, Gideon Rose, fellow here at the Academy this spring. We live here in this house of a guy who went to Nuremberg as his last, the last occupant ended up there. We look out our windows at the house of the Wannsee Conference, and I've come to think of the whole experience as kind of a political memento mori. I now understand finally those skulls on the desks of St. Jerome and other kind of people where you're looking at it and going, oh, why do they have those skulls there?
Mm-hmm.
It forces you to think. How did your father's experiences in Berlin affect his life when he came back to the States?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, your life growing up? He had seen all this. What stayed with him and how did it affect his ongoing life?
Well, it was the transformative experience, and in his description of it, it was partly which other people concur that the facade of everyday existence, which usually keeps family life and domestic life and private life closed, was open to see, and you could see people in the buildings doing their life in the midst of this hellish world. So that experience of having everyday life exposed and still also going on. That, I think those are the two. One is the experience of the ruin, and the experience of the exposure of everyday life in complete ruin. And he photographed. I was telling my daughter that my father climbed up on the Reichstag metal cupola with his sketchbook and pen in hand, and thought, I am out of my mind because I'm going to fall down. So there was a kind of a hunger to draw these ruins. But the other thing he found very telling, and that I think was probably key to his art, is that in the ruin, hence the Ferris wheel, people were living as if the ordinary life continued. So children, he describes, children were still playing the same games that I played as a child. And he did these wonderful drawings of children playing this particular game called Playing Statues. I eventually actually was written by one of those kids who was playing statues, wrote to me like 5 years ago and said, I know your father's work, and he drew me playing statues. So playing in the ruins, already forgetting was, I think, a very important. So seeing and forgetting. When he came back to the United States, that's a kind of codicil. He was one of the first artists to paint he had a show here in Berlin in the House am Waldsee. It was a big success. He came to the United States. He redid his show, and it was also a big success. But by 1948, some of the critics were saying, Henry Koerner has to get over it because the war is behind us. So 1 year after the Holocaust, 2 years, the idea was we want to get rid of all of that. I mean, can you imagine, like now, 50, 100 years later, the idea that you process the past in a few months. So for him, that was an experience of radical forgetting and of exposure. Probably. Yeah.
So I have a question it seems to me that in the middle part of your triptych of the talk, you raise a question that for me is a familiar question that we ask, let's say, of disciplines like anthropology. Namely, what are the origins of your discipline, and how is your discipline actually located in, let's say, colonial violence, right? And so I was wondering if we could ask the same kind of question of art history. Mm-hmm. And I say that specifically because it seems astonishing to me that people like Junger and Schmidt are turning to art and to paintings in the midst of the catastrophe that they are, in a sense, producing. And so I want you to say something more about what the discipline of art history itself is in Europe in this period, and how it actually intersects or interpellates the politics of power that animate the war.
So that's a very, very great question, very complicated to parse. But I would say the main avatars of art history back then were Panofsky was probably the most important, and he was a kind of came from the Abbé Warburg school. So Abbé Warburg had a kind of anthropological model of art history, which was done in Hamburg, where he worked and built a library, and it was very open to in fact, not open, it called for a combination of anthropology and art history as kind of image theory, which is done here in Berlin a little bit by people like Horst Bredekamp took up this idea. So there was an image theory, which also was closely connected back to the question of the imagination with theories about the mind, ways in which the eye perceives imagery. Warburg was very interested in images of movement, in paintings of the Renaissance, but also film. He went to Cologne, to the Pueblo peoples, and he found connections in this idea of images and rapid movement and the instantaneity of life, which I think things like Junger's fascination with the Augenblick, that's the sort of Warburgian landscape. Panofsky comes along and he wants to make it, and he says this, into a humanistic discipline. He wants to kind of tame a lot of that anthropological and also temporally complicated material. And his idea is that the paintings are filled with symbols. And what art history first has to do is parse the symbols, often using texts. He has a vision that he's going to go beyond that, and he has a name for that, which is called iconology. No one really knows what that's supposed to be in a way, but it's some kind of better thing than just decoding images. So why he doesn't interpret Bosch is because one limitation of iconography is actually believes that it has to have solutions. And the idea of having a solution, and the idea that the solution will be found in the long tradition of humanistic research and learning and literature, reaching from classical antiquity more or less through Goethe and Lessing and Schiller to the gymnasium education of Panofsky, was a very strong political idea. And people like Ernst Cassirer are involved in that sort of thing. And then when you get to somebody like Frenger, you have to imagine what was more or less forgotten, which is a very strong expressionistic art history that was done before the Nazi takeover, but it became a kind of norm during the Nazi period, where it was very subjective. It was also very judgmental. There were certain artists you didn't write about, but it was a lot of it was about making the reader feel uneasy and at the same time elevated. And so someone like Wilhelm Frenger, though he was left-leaning, came out of expressionist theater. He ran an expressionist theater in Berlin during the Second World War. And there was a whole host of art historians in that vein. And then after World War II, that kind of art history, and I defer to the German art historians in this room, but that kind of art history was really no longer acceptable. The idea of subjective, expressionistic, very, very wild prose, and people like Hans Sedlmayr would be the person. And there's a lot of uncanny interest also in race, a kind of fascination with racial difference and hatred of racial difference. And then I think one should also say that most of the art historians then in the Nazi period were like horrible art historians. Like everybody got kicked out. The Jewish art history was the dominant form of most of the great art historians were Jewish. They either died or emigrated. And so they were left with, Germany was left with a small group of publishing art historians with no one really kind of reads anymore. But so I think in the picture of art history, as far as it relates to this, the glory of humanistic art history is that it believes in that art speaks from friend to friend. I would say that it is a peaceful communique. But there are many works of art that aren't peaceful. And people like Hans Baldung Green, who's a German artist, all very, very much not a friendly artist. If you think about friendly artists and Bosch is definitely not a friendly artist. So when you have somebody like that who doesn't want you to understand him, but wants you to be confused, the humanistic model becomes more difficult. But you also want to maintain it. You don't want to go into a direction in which it's purely expressionistic, subjective stuff.
Would you mind saying a little bit more about
He has a question first.
this?
Okay, all right.
Sorry, would you mind saying a little bit more about the sort of curious affinity that early German art history seems to have felt, especially for early Netherlandish painting?
Yes.
Always seemed curious, especially given the distance, the gap between the two heritages.
Right.
Was Panofsky claiming early Netherlandish painting, back away from the nationalists in a way when he wrote those lectures?
Early Netherlandish painting was rediscovered, resuscitated by German art lovers in the early part of the 19th century, by the Boisarets, by Friedrich Schlegel, by the Romantics. And at that point, it was a mixture of feeling that Netherlandish and German belonged to some ethnic continuity, but also because early Netherlandish art was being torn from the churches by Napoleon's secularization campaigns. And so early Netherlandish painting became very much the emblem of rescuing church art, bringing it into museums, and getting art also a sacral veneer. That is, art is not just beauty. It's not like the 18th century where artists are trying to emulate a beauty ideal from classical antiquity. No, it's got to be wholly sacred and torn from its context. But B, which is interesting, I think, is it has to be different. So the German Romantics liked the fact that Netherlandish art wasn't Italian. It wasn't French neoclassicism. It was different. And difference itself was a sign of indigeneity, of being either Netherlandish or German. And that is, we're not all the same. And and Napoleon for them represented a kind of flattening effect, both killing the churches, but also getting rid of difference in favor of an enlightened, uniform idea of the law and society. So early Netherlandish painting had that function. In Panofsky's case, it's a more complicated story because he comes to the United States as somebody who's equally at home with Italian painting. He writes an important book on Titian. His early work is actually expressionist art history with lots of Hegel about these German sculptures. And then he comes to the United States. He escapes to the United States, and he begins to teach in Princeton. And he chooses Dürer, which is a very complicated thing to do. In 1945, he publishes his Dürer monograph as a Jewish person in the United States. But he does that, I think, because he wants to establish another Germany, one that's cosmopolitan, one that is open to Italy. Dürer as coming in with the Italian. And in the case of Netherlandish art, I think that he's writing these in 45 through 47, giving them in Harvard. I doubt whether he had too much worry about what the ethnic nature of early Netherlandish painting was. Having said all of this, I think by the time Panofsky's working, I think he was fascinated by perspective, the achievement of Renaissance art, and telling a different story than the Italian story, one that would come from manuscript illuminations, and then that would make people realize how incredible Jan van Eyck is. The book's really centered on Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden. How do you get to effectively like photographic paintings that you can't tell that they're a painting? So he had a technical interest, and he had and he loved all the symbolism. But but there is that inheritance. After all, early Netherlandish painting is the same time as Italian Renaissance art, and people think about the Italian stuff as modern, and the early Netherlandish painting as as medieval, even though the Italian Renaissance people were, the people of the Italian Renaissance were buying Jan van Eyck as the best painter you could acquire. So there's this funny question of periodization. One small little footnote is Bosch was thought in my lifetime and through the 20th century as being a medieval painter, whereas in the 16th century, the earliest records we have of people writing about Bosch, somewhat from a scholarly point of view, was that he is a Mannerist painter. They thought he lived way after Raphael and Michelangelo, and they thought he was just trying to do this to be new and innovative. So you have two views. One, he's a medievalist, which is the modern, and then the closer to the period was probably that he's a kind of post-Renaissance person who's doing this new stuff. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this very astonishing presentation. I've never heard like an art historian speak about art that seemed to be so driven from like being having art in the family, like your father being a painter and not a band painter at all, it seems. So in a way, I felt like it's a kind of a role model of art history being so close to heritage of practice in a certain way, and I guess that stimulated very much your very deep dive into the meta in a way, and it was a very I felt very moved.
Oh, thank you.
Actually by your talk. I was wondering I was waiting. As you kept talking about Bosch, I was thinking, where's Max Beckmann and William Kentridge? So I guess we have to buy the book. Good advertising.
Good advertising.
Strategy. But also, I felt in a way, for artists, you kind of cannot avoid to have received a package from your ancestors and somehow deal with it in a certain way and dive into this. You produce works that are partly intuition, partly strategy, partly results of brain and thinking about it and making decisions and sort of going that way and not that way. And maybe that's the position from which you are talking about art in a very similar way. That's why I felt so, Jesus, I've never heard anything like this. I mean, just the manner. Also, you dealt with the pictures, showing the details, and it was a very unusual. I assume you did that, or did a student do that?
That's me.
I thought so. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, one thing, thank you very much. That's really good and kind of you to say. One thing I would say that it was influenced by being in a family that made art was that we knew that my father had no explanation of what his pictures were, or if he did, we would like him to stop talking. Because we knew that the people would not buy them once he started to explain them. So we sort of say, please. The interpretations were wrong and they were counterproductive. So and then I know that there's no way. So some of the pictures I know why he painted them, because I sort of set him up in front of the picture. So I know better, but we all know that there was no explanation. So I start with the absolute. Not that there aren't some important solutions that I'm sure there might be some solution to the Garden of Delights at some level, but at another level, as you say, choices are made and there's no way of knowing why such a choice was made. So that does help, I think, right, it gives you a certain freedom. Yeah. Thank you.